Hello, welcome back to Food Safety Office Hours. Today, we're going to be addressing a topic relevant to many food manufacturers, and that is risk-based approaches to managing allergen cross-contact. And so, to discuss this topic, I'm joined by experts in the field. So, first up, we have Dr. Joe Baumert, who is a professor in the Department of Food Science and Technology at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. Joe is also the director of FARP, so the Food Allergy Research Program. His research interests include the digestive stability of major food allergens, determination of the minimal eliciting dose for specific allergens, and development of improved immunochemical methods for detection. So Joe will start us off, and I think we're going to get a talk that overviews sort of risk-based approaches to allergen management. And then we're going to be hearing from Dr. Ben Remington, who I see on the call. Hey, Ben, who is the managing director of the Remington Consulting Group, as well as an adjunct assistant professor at the University of Nebraska, working with the Food Allergy Research Program. So Ben's work focuses on the clinical risk assessment of food allergens and allergen management within food production facilities. And I believe Ben's going to give us a talk on recent updates to guidance on allergen management that has taken a risk-based framework. So as always, the presentations, after those, we will stop the recording so that people can feel free to ask questions openly. I have, of course, some that were pre-submitted already lined up, but you can submit questions through the chat at any time, live during the presentation or during the Q&A. So with that, I would like to hand it over to Joe to kick us off.
Hey, well, Abby, thank you for the kind introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here today. This is a presentation that I think Ben and I have in tandem worked on in various elements in both identifying the data needed to go towards risk-based management systems and providing some of the ideas on application as well. So today, I'm going to kick us off by giving us an overview of food allergens and a little bit of the context of the international and national scope of where we're at with food allergens and a little bit on risk-based approaches. And Ben's going to dive deeper into that application as well. So, of course, with food allergies, we know that they are a public health risk that does require management. And with that, we see that there are various prevalence figures out there across the world. In the US, we typically see somewhere between 4 to 8% of children, maybe 1 to 2% of adults that have food allergies. So a significant proportion of the population. Some estimates are even up to about 10% of the overall population. And those are the ones that have a direct IgE-mediated food allergy. If we think about that more broadly, though, we have maybe an individual in a family that has food allergies, but it's not just that individual that's working to avoid their offending allergen. It's the family. Sometimes it's the institutes like daycare, schools, and so forth. So the setting in which we're managing allergens is much bigger. So we always want to keep that in perspective. Severity of response, of course, with these, we can have, unfortunately, life-threatening and fatal reactions to food allergies. And with that, again, we see that there can be mild to those very severe and fatal type responses. And it's dependent likely upon a dose that we'll talk about as well. Sensitivity, small amounts can cause reactions, and we'll get a little bit more into that. So it becomes that challenge, and how do we manage that within the supply chain, within a facility that typically is going to be handling these different allergenic food sources, because they are nutritious and wholesome food sources for the vast majority of consumers. Avoidance currently is the key way to avoid that offending allergen. So avoidance of that residue of the food, the offending food is important. So that strict avoidance, diet, label reading, asking a lot of questions becomes critical for the safety of those individuals. And we do know that there is a significant dollar figure associated with the burden of food allergies. Just in childhood food allergy alone, a study from Northwestern from a few years back estimated that around just under $25 billion of impact from childhood food allergies. And again, that's roughly $5,000 per family with food allergies per year. So significant challenge both financially as well as managing and assuring that safety. When we talk about food allergies, we're talking about those immunological reactions. So we just want to make sure we're all calibrated in the same way. We're talking about those IgE-mediated food allergies. So IgE is, of course, the antibody that's associated with recognition of those offending allergenic proteins. And so with that, we can also see food allergies broadly encompassing delayed type cell-mediated delayed type hypersensitivities, such as celiac disease, that does have an immune component to it. We're differentiating that from food intolerances, lactose intolerance, and others in this conversation today. Sometimes you'll see true food allergies as labeled. Again, that's in reference, we're focusing on that IgE-mediated response, in which we have two phases. We'll be sensitized, that initial exposure that triggers the immune reaction and immune response to remember those proteins as offending or foreign proteins that need to be removed from the system. Upon subsequent exposure, we can then have that elicitation phase, and that's where we'll start to see those symptoms that can be typically immediate type symptoms within minutes to maybe a couple hours after exposure to those offending proteins. So we do see that we can have mild to moderate to severe reactivity, and again, probably dependent upon that dose received at the time of exposure. Can have multiple systems involved. And so we could have skin symptoms with hives and so forth, rash, abdominal pain, bringing in the GI tract, vomiting, um, respiratory, where we're seeing maybe throat swelling, wheezing, asthma. Certainly asthmatic response can impart that severe type reactivity. We often hear about anaphylaxis, in which, by definition, anaphylaxis means that there's two organ systems involved. So in theory, you could have mild anaphylaxis, but most time you'll hear anaphylaxis in the context of more severe type outcomes. So involvement of asthma plus vomiting. So we'll have two systems involved. It would be more of that moderate to severe type response. Food allergens are associated with proteins. I've revised this a little bit to say almost always proteins because we are seeing an emerging area with alpha-gal, which is reactivity to a carbohydrate moiety from being sensitized from tick bite from certain species. And that then develops an allergic response upon consumption to red meats, such as beef, pork, and so forth. So almost always proteins. For today, we'll kind of focus in on that protein aspect. Across the world, of course, we do see legislation that's been imparted to help provide clear labeling and management of priority or major food allergens. And here in the US, we have the top 9, which now includes sesame as of January 1st, 2023, with the implementation of the FASTER Act that revised the Food Allergen Labeling Consumer Protection Act. Again, this requires that we have plain English labeling of those allergens that you see here from the top 9 when utilized as an inclusion in the formulation, as a processing aid, and so forth. Elsewhere in the world, there can be regional differences. So it's important to understand, certainly if you're exporting to different markets, what those differences are in those priority allergens. So as an example, we see molluscan shellfish, mustard on the list in Canada. And again, certain legislation and certain regional differences in their prevalence of food allergy can play a role in those decisions. One of the important things, as you saw with the old Big 8 list of allergens, was a derivation from a 1995 FAO consultation that was part of an ask from Codex at the time to develop a list of priority allergens. And at the time, they came up with the Big Eight allergen list, primarily based upon case reports and reports from clinicians on where they're seeing the most prevalent foods that are being associated with IgE-mediated food allergy. There wasn't a systematic approach to the evaluation, in part because there was limited data information at the time. Fast forward to 2020, there was an ask from Codex Committee on Food Labeling to develop a FAO WHO expert consultation that could reevaluate the current list, at the time, the Big Eight list, as well as update. Have there been any changes that are important? So should there be additions, perhaps subtractions, and so forth? So as part of that, this first session was convened in November of 2020, in which the experts, part of the FAO WHO consultation, began to develop that criteria that we felt was important criteria to involve for decisions on whether it merited a priority or major allergen status. And those were prevalence, potency, and severity. So prevalence being how often do we see it, again, on an international basis in this context. Potency, identifying based upon how we see that dose response effect in the population. And we'll talk about that in a moment. And then severity, what type of reactivity are we seeing? And again, with the focus more on that severe type outcome as a potential. So thinking about that anaphylaxis component. So fast forward, there were recommendations that you saw in that report that I showed, and the links will be certainly provided in the slide set if you're interested. Fast forward to the end of 2024, we had Codex Alimentarius update their general standard for the labeling of prepackaged foods, in which the allergen list, the traditional Big Eight list, was originally identified in 1999. To this, the recommendations were taken up by Codex, and there was a revision to include the ones that you see here. So cereals containing gluten, crustacea, eggs, fish, peanuts, sesame as a new addition, and then in this case, specific tree nuts rather than generic tree nut list that was previously indicated. And this is information on almond, cashew, hazelnut, pecan, pistachio, walnut that had sufficient information or indication of cross-reactivity. For example, walnut and pecan that we know occurs often in those individuals. So this is the list that would merit based on prevalence, potency, severity as a key priority allergen list. With that, though, there was a recognition of some of the regional differences that were discussed in that report, noting things such as buckwheat, which is Southeast Asia countries can have a higher prevalence and reports of reactivity. Celery, for example, celeriac in Europe. So you do see differences that these could be considered based upon individual risk assessments for potential inclusion in the country's list. You'll see on this list, soybean was included. That's a difference from prior where soybean was included as a priority allergen. In this case, it didn't have the data to merit the prevalence, potency, severity standpoint, so it was recommended to be removed from the priority list. But there were notations of regional differences. So I would still anticipate soy being on several countries' list. Certainly in the US, as a call out here, it would be a process to be able to remove it from FALCPA. So I don't see that probably on the horizon anytime soon. So for all intent purposes, definitely continue to keep soy as a priority allergen in the US. Moving into the US a little bit on the same tone, we've had a lot of activity around guidance on priority allergens and redefining some of those. So the FDA had released final guidance in January of this year, which was a part of a update to the question and answer associated with VALCPA. Noteworthy changes that I want to highlight in the time we have today was a revised list of major tree nut allergens, in which you see a defined group that I show at the top of the slide here. So almond, Brazil, and so forth. This is a much different list compared to what we had prior. I'll show that in a moment, that prior guidance list. Milk was also redefined in the context of allergen labeling requirements to go beyond domesticated bovine cows to include goat's milk, sheep's milk, and other ruminants as well. Similarly, egg was included, in which it was beyond domesticated chickens onto ducks, geese, and so forth. So I often get the question, why did we go from a list? Oops, there we go. A list that included quite a few different sources, including coconut, which is one of the most common questions I get. Why did we go from this list to a list that now includes that refined list that I showed in the prior slide? FDA did include a frequently asked questions website link that you can go to get more context. It's not all that clear on what the underpinning decisions were in the revision of this tree nut list, but I would have to venture to guess that it was part of the FAO work as well as part of an activity that was working in tandem that the FDA developed guidance and now finalized in January on evaluating the public health importance of allergens other than the major food allergens. So kind of a process to evaluate those that could potentially be on the horizon. Similarly to what we saw in the part one of the FAO WHO, the approach was to use criteria. Similarly, prevalence, potency, and severity also were part of that. So utilizing this, I think, as a process, maybe had the opportunity for FDA to have a criteria to revise that tree nut list, in which we see, again, that an example with coconut, we have limited data on several of these key criteria. Again, I think we can see that food allergens are a public health risk, and we know that they can cause those severe reactions. We can see that there are regulatory risks, and certainly translates to business risk. On the regulatory side, we know that food allergens, unfortunately, continue to be a key contributor to the overall number of reportable food registry entries, where it continues to be one of the highest causes of entries. And with that, we also know that there's a number of recalls associated with food allergens, and we try to track allergens, food allergen recalls and alerts, both from FDA and USDA side, and again, have noted that there's been kind of that continual trend of allergen-associated recalls in the industry. Gadari Sharma from the FDA published in 2023 a nice summary of information that they had available from the FDA on what was associated with some of those FDA-related food allergen recalls. And again, not surprising, we see related recalls associated with many of the food products because they're in the facilities. It's again, what's contributing, what's those root causes that contribute to those potential recalls. And while there isn't always a lot of information on the root cause, what was able to be gleaned is that packaging and wrong label, things like that sort, still contribute to many of the recalls associated with food allergens. We focus a lot on cross contact, and certainly there have been opportunities for recalls to occur because of cross contact in facility, maybe in a supplier's facility and so forth. But again, packaging, labeling seems to be continuing to be one of the primary causes of recalls. Yep, and so with this kind of a summary, label content, label management, a big chunk of those that were identified, cross contact, supply chain, certainly were the others. So how do we go about doing effective food allergen management? Certainly, we're talking about risk assessment today and thinking more quantitatively these days, but it's really coming back to the fundamentals on being able to identify the hazards and implementing preventive controls, utilizing GMPs and so forth to manage those. Once we have those in check, we can begin to bring in that quantitative nature to start thinking about how we may benchmark that for decisions around cautionary advisory labeling, for example. There are a number of revisions internationally as well. So Codex Code of Practice on Food Allergen Management was revised, again, taking much more of a farm to fork approach in, again, with the emphasis on preventing and minimizing allergen cross contact. So very much similar to what we see in other food safety regulations like FSMA here in the US. The General Code of General Principles of Food Hygiene was updated as well and has emphasis in many places around allergen management using a HACCP or a preventive approach as well. Certainly here in the US, we have FSMA that does require identification of food allergens as a chemical hazard and identifying that allergen control program and how we're going to manage that. So management through GMPs, preventive controls in that respect. So many will have well seen this and have implemented these into programs. But the key components within FSMA, focusing on GMPs, really that preventive HARP-C approach to evaluation as well. So, and then supply chain as key areas of focus as well. So in along the lines, the CGMPs were updated also, do definitely have an emphasis in various areas on where we can minimize allergen cross contact through personnel, plant construction design, sanitary operations, and so forth. So the question always is, how much is too much, or how clean is clean enough, if we think about it in that context? As mentioned earlier, it's milligram doses that can contribute to reactions or part per million concentrations. So these low milligram or low concentrations can contribute to reactions in some of the more sensitive individuals. So in the population, we know that there is diversity, and you may see individuals reacting to these very low doses to the left of the screen, 0.1 milligrams of protein from the source, all the way up to, in this example of a peanut, where an individual may react to 100 milligrams of peanut, equivalent to maybe a small Spanish peanut or a half of a Virginia peanut. So each of these represents where that individual may have their initial reactive dose. So we can have a diversity of sensitivity in the population. All have IgE-mediated allergy, but differences in where they individually react. So of course, as we build food safety programs, we're going to be protective of as many individuals as possible. So we're focused in on these low doses at the left. We've used that data, so you'll see author here, Ben Remington, was lead author in the project that we had between FARP and TNO to model what we have for priority allergens. And we can get a dose distribution of those eliciting doses or thresholds, and then be able to begin to identify reference doses. So milligram doses that would be protective for the vast majority, minimize that opportunity for severe outcome or risk, severe type of symptoms that could occur. So generally speaking, in that 1 to 5% of the population. And Ben will talk a little bit more about that, I believe, in his presentation. Part of an additional aspect of the FAO-WHO consultation was to develop, to review, and then recommend those doses. So these are reference doses. Remember, milligrams of total protein from each of the allergenic sources, not part per million concentrations. So 1 milligram of total walnut protein, as an example at the top here. So these are reference doses that then can be used in various contexts for benchmarks and identification of labeling strategies, how we might go about evaluating potential cross contact. In the FDA context, we do get a few hints while they haven't established a reference dose or a threshold for IgE-mediated food allergies. We have a few reference points that where FDA has acknowledged that there is this emerging clinical data that can be used to model and used for those risk assessments. So the example here is in the draft compliance policy guide for FDA staff, where they did acknowledge those dose response effect. With that, we also have Chapter 11. So the food allergy program is part of the HARP-C process. We do have draft guidance in which FDA again indicated that there is a emerging area of information on population threshold responses, and that these could be considered as part of a evaluation to scientifically validate assessments and make decisions around appropriate allergen controls. So while they didn't specifically reference what the reference doses or action levels may be, they did reference some of the key work. Again, the study of Ben Remington, as well as some of the FAO WHO work. Why is this important? I get the question of why are we moving to risk-based approaches? I think this is a slide that nicely summarizes one of the key areas of concern that we have internationally, and that's around precautionary allergen labeling or PAL statements, also called advisory statements here in the US. The may contain traces, all the numerous derivations of that risk communication tool that can vary amongst how individual companies are utilizing and making those decision points and communicating that to the allergic consumers. So with that, fortunately, we see an abundance of use. So it's rather ubiquitous in use of both PAL statements in general, but a variety of different PAL statements. And as a result, we see frustration, confusion by allergic consumers to the point where we know that they're trying to assess the risk on what the terminology may impose. So a may contain seems to have less of a issue around ignoring the statement, so they'll avoid, whereas we see maybe 40 to 60% of the population will ignore certain statements like process in a facility. So they're taking risk into their own hands. And again, we're losing that opportunity to have a transparent risk communication tool. So with all of this, as I close here, we do know that we have some additional discussions in the Codex context, both from CCFL as well as Codex Alimentarius, on how to implement reference doses into a risk assessment framework for PAL. So it's not a complete process yet, but it's still ongoing in discussions. We do know that a number of countries individually have been evaluating the work of FAO WHO, and some of which, such as the Netherlands, have implemented the need to utilize this risk-based approach, utilize those reference doses as part of the evaluation process to justify the use of PAL and support that use as needed. Belgium has also considered it through a science committee, as well as a longstanding approach by the Allergen Bureau of Australia and New Zealand, the VITAL process, where they have utilized for a number of years these reference doses, the underpinning threshold values. They transitioned to the ED5 values or the FAO WHO reference doses I showed earlier about a year ago now. So again, effective management is important. We'll talk more about that process in which we can utilize quantitative effects, but it really does come down to understanding and identifying those hazards, beginning to identify where we can minimize that opportunity. So thinking about supply chain risks, how that may come into the facility, how we're going to manage operationally, cleaning, and so forth. So with that, I'll close my presentation and turn it over to Ben.
Okay, give me a shout if you can hear me. I'll just leave it at Joe since he's unmuted. You can hear me all right, Joe?
I can hear you okay.
Perfect. Then I hope you're all able now to see my slides. So I have a
Yes.
title slide, which says WHO guidance on allergen assessments, which Joe covered pretty comprehensively. So I can breeze through those and touch just on a few small points. And then the practical applications of a risk-based framework. So I would like to go through some different case studies at the end of my talk, maybe have that touch on some of the things for discussion, but also to uh, really go through the broader risk assessment piece before we're doing something quantitative about what the FAO WHO has talked about in recent meetings for risk assessment across the all different food business operators, from something along the lines of a food truck or a food cart on a corner to the largest food business operators in the world. I have a quick disclaimer because depending on where you've seen me, where you've seen my name, I work as a contractor and a consultant for the US FDA. This is a very personal presentation and response, so anything here is my own view and not from the US FDA. Same thing, being part of the FAO WHO expert consultations, working as a contractor for the FAO. This is my own individual capacity and not in a governmental role or an FAO role. So, starting with the very basics, I like to try and make you guys laugh for a second, and makes me have an easier presentation at that point. This is a very relevant example. And it's just, can we assume there's a common level of knowledge at any and all levels of food business operators? And I don't think we can make many or any assumptions. And the example I give you is completely not related to food. But if you're traveling and you're going on a trip somewhere, is there going to be an iron in your hotel room, your hotel? Is there laundry service in the hotel? If there's no iron in your hotel, is there laundry service 3 blocks away, somewhere farther? Uh, I say this because we were at a government provided hotel for a week-long meeting. There was no iron in the hotel, and there was no laundry service in the hotel. So working from 7 in the morning until 7 at night with very wrinkly shirts was quite funny. But what do you try to do when you have no access to it? So if you don't have access to what you assume is going to be there, do you have the resources and capability to find a proper solution, or do you try and steam your shirt in the shower like I did on day number 2, and then from then on? Or if you have prior experience, were you like somebody in the room who actually brought an iron in their carry-on luggage, not in their check bag because they might lose that bag, but they had it in their carry-on luggage in a little mini travel iron about the size of your hand? So I think you can see how this pivots easily to any area of risk assessment or different things within a lot of different areas. But prior experience plays a big part. What do you do when you don't have what you expect to be there, and what responses do you have? And in the end, is wrinkle-free clothing recommended, regulated? Is it regulated and enforced, or regulated but they let it slide? So all of these things come back to food safety in different ways. And when talking about the basics of allergen risk assessment, we were able to laugh about this, but then say, what are we looking at? What's most relevant, most fundamental? And some of the things that Joe was touching on, but maybe didn't highlight in direct sentences, that we look at the different categories of food safety hazards: chemical, microbial, physical. And depending on the document you're reading or where you are in the world, food allergens may be a fourth one added there. It might be in a parenthesis within chemical. It I also saw it at some point somehow under physical in a different document the other day when I was doing this presentation. So where they are, where they're expected to be, it would really benefit everyone if food allergens were separated on their own as their own category of hazard. Another one is that it's clear to a lot of people in this room, food allergy risk assessments, they support informed decisions throughout the entire supply chain, and consistent assessments and management will improve food safety and public health. And contrary to popular belief, risk assessment is popular or possible for all food business operators, including the very beginnings of the primary production supply chain. And that's because the initial risk assessment steps are common. We might not all be doing the same things you're doing as an in-product producer that's able to do clean in place things for some sort of liquid production, but you should know what you're having on site, whether you're growing it, whether you're purchasing it. Do the ingredients include one of the major food allergens of concern or not? And then the more tricky part about cross contact, but at least those initial steps of awareness, what's intentionally there. And then that bottom bullet point, the analytical data is often talked about when we get to higher levels of debates around allergen risk assessment, but analytical data is not often needed to actually complete a risk assessment. So we can kind of get lost in the details around, or we don't have a specific test for this, or there's some uncertainty around that, or this matrix of this, but that's us getting lost in the weeds instead of addressing the bigger picture that we probably have enough as is to move forward with risk-based allergen assessment and management policies and guidelines and take that bigger step instead of delaying another 5 or 10 years to make sure that every possible scenario is covered for every possible situation. So after that, I'm not going to talk about analytical methods, complex statistical methods, or differences in information that a food business operator and regulator could have, because if we have a future system with transparent, clear communication of information, you should be able to communicate between food business operators and regulators in a more open way than we are now, especially if there's something risk-based, those reference doses that Joe was talking about, then we'd have more of a benchmark together to talk about something and share a lot more information maybe than we're doing now in different jurisdictions. So Joe already mentioned the different FAO WHO meetings. I wanted to again reiterate those recommended priority food allergens or allergenic foods are in the revised general standard for labeling of prepackaged foods. The recommended reference doses and precautionary allergen framework, they are nearing the final process of the codex work. So nobody at this point has really been pushing against the reference doses that Joe had on screen, the 2 milligrams, 1 milligram, 3 milligrams. Those numbers, and they'll come up in my presentation again, those have not been pushed back against, but the recommended PAL framework and exact wordings for the guidance, those are being discussed. But it seems like those reference doses are going to be carried through for potential uses with precautionary allergen labeling. And then depending on the local area, they might be using them for recall evaluations or those sorts of things. If you're going to reject something incoming from imports, you might be having reference doses there as the types of levels you might allow to come through or not, depending on how it's labeled and those sorts of things. So precautionary allergen labeling is one option. Looking at more risk-based exemptions is another option, but you also have trade, recall, everything that way for where you might be doing something that's a bit more risk-based, even extending to the clinical identification of the most sensitive people with food allergies and how you might manage them. So using these recommended reference doses to help identify who is the most sensitive group of consumers with food allergies and how to manage them with a different approach than the other 95% of people with food allergies. There was also that 6th meeting, which I can't say aligns exactly with my key messages slide, but it's very, very close to those key messages, and some more information will be coming out hopefully in the next days or weeks with the the summary and conclusions on that one. Joe showed the reports. There's also the in brief brochures. The links are on my slides as well. But we were able to condense nearly 200 pages of reports down to 2 pages. And that's for each meeting, bringing out the key figures and the key text to get you within 2 pages to the overall update. These have already been shared by the organizers today. And they have that for all meetings, including the precautionary labeling and the exemption framework, and how you might use reference doses in a risk-based way for exemptions as well. So a large part of this is about balancing risk management and communication options with the different capabilities to achieve your greatest public health benefit. And those capabilities include food business capabilities, your analytical capabilities, your education within the industry or consumers, and then how much adherence you have to labeling by consumers or not. Where are they starting to ignore your labeling because they deem things to be over-labeled? So all that plays a balance on if you're actually having an impact on public health for the better or for the worse. And reference doses that Joe talked about are just one piece of that. So these milligram protein amounts, they fall in there. We really debated at the FAO WHO level of having a lower number or this number. And what we'd seen is if you have a lower number, the rest of this balance starts to shift, and it doesn't take a big change in consumer habits to really increase the number of expected reactions. So the numbers you see on screen for the milligram amounts, which translate later to analytical action levels or concentrations if you're doing something testing. But these milligram amounts on screen, they provided the best balance for us working wise in a food facility, in an analytical lab, in a clinic to start to segregate people and separate them from the most sensitive to the other consumers with allergies, and have visible working amounts, something that you can see. If it was invisible and so small you can't see it, then there's a lot of other things we deal with, and we're going to be over labeled, and everything will say may contain everything. So there was a balance to work with analytically and in facility because we know visibly clean is quite important for the food industry as well. So a couple quick shots of that to show you. You might have a piece of shrimp, and on the left-hand side works in centimeters for each ring is half a centimeter in diameter. So you have a visible piece of shrimp there for how much is needed before you're gonna to reach that reference dose. Same with hazelnuts, multiple small pieces of hazelnuts. On the right is a whole hazelnut. Cashews, same thing. We could go through this for all the different foods. Sesame seeds, you need 4 or 5 sesame seeds before you reach the reference dose. So we're talking about visible things you can see in your food facility. Joe already showed you this one for peanuts, showing the different versions across the top. You hit the reference dose somewhere in between those 2 pieces of peanut. But I also put it up here for powder. We've had people working in flavoring drinks industries where anything that's this most left-hand version of the powder, just tiny amounts, will alter the quality of their product, either in color or flavor, smell. So they're working very, very clean. And if you do the calculations on how much cross contact they need in their weighing area, you'd need more than a gram of powder or more than 1,000 milligrams of powder before you'd come anywhere near the reference dose. So something even less than 10 milligrams is a quality issue for them, and they're never seeing that. But they had may contain on all their products for all the allergens in their facility because they were worried about really causing a severe reaction. But in reality, you needed much more than you could see in this most far right-hand container to cause an allergen issue. So that lack of initial understanding and education led them to be overcautious, which would actually, in the end, lead consumers to ignore their labeling and take bigger risks. So that balance of what's a real risk, what's not, starts to come back into view a bit more. And that's not always easy in the beginning, but it's very important to get through. So on the side of precautionary allergen labeling and whether you want to say may contain or not, or maybe your supplier is bringing through a may contain label and you want to know, do I need to carry that through to my end product? That's where some of these reference doses could go a little bit into effect and help you a bit more. And the guidelines that are being discussed at the codex level from FAO, WHO, it's putting a line somewhere in the middle where you have a cutoff using that reference dose, where below that line you would not have any statements, and above that line you would have a may contain statement. Now, there's a flow chart which essentially says you're doing appropriate quality controls, hygiene, and risk mitigation practices, so you're making safe food. That's step number one in all of these cases. And then you're doing your risk assessment, and it's very vague at this point, but if your risk assessment shows you're above the reference dose, first, could you be below the reference dose if you take a few other risk mitigation practices? So is it reasonable for you to get below the reference dose? Yes or no? And if you do your risk assessment, you're doing what you can risk mitigation wise, and you're not below the reference dose, then you'd put on a PAL. But otherwise, the recommendation would be to not have a PAL or not have a may contain statement. So say you could work through your ingredient supplier. How much is that in your final product? Is that going to be something that needs to be carried through? And I have an example of that a little bit later. But just before the case studies, I want to tell you this overview of a production facility, I think to everyone on this call, looks very normal. You have all the different stages of production, from raw materials to labeling, packaging, and selling to the consumer. To others, this looks very overwhelming, and the risk assessment will never get started because they don't understand all steps of this picture that's going on, and they're going to end up trying to put may contain on there out of caution and just be done with it. So there are different ways to communicate, and that's a few of the bits of allergen risk assessment that we really have to be aware of. So there are other groups that put in similar things in different ways, which you say you collect your raw material information, you make sure you apply the correct recipe, you have the correct label, you prevent the exchange of products and labels, or you make sure the right product goes into the right label. And then you're trying to prevent cross contact as a last step. So you're making safe food, you're making sure what you're putting in the box has the correct label and the correct recipe together. And if you're able to do that, then we're talking about cross contact risk assessments. So it's, again, very basic, but certain things can be overwhelming to others. And I wanted to go through some case studies, and I know that we're supposed to be done in 10 minutes, which is a bit tight for time. But I wanted to show you some things with particulates. Particulates are quite an issue in food industry, and these may contain labels, but they could be more simple to deal with than you'd expect. So a lot of the times it's a black box. We don't know what's there is the answer we're given. But if you look into it, you could find what you expect to be there. You could weigh it with a scale. You could measure it with a ruler. You could start to see, okay, this is what's above the reference dose. This is what would be below. What am I seeing in my production area? If you look at the Allergen Bureau website, which is running a big program in Australia for looking at am I above or below the reference dose, they're seeing roughly 3/4 of their remaining may contain statements are because of PALs, or because of particulates. So we know particulates are a big issue. When they were moving from a lower amount, the ED1, which was the prior vital, to the newest vital, which is the FAO levels, they were seeing a reduction in PAL, but only 20%. So not as much as you might expect because of particulates. So the industry is having issues with chunks of nuts or chunks of dough or other things where it didn't matter what the reference dose was at that point because it's more than that already. So they, that's good to know. So we might not reduce PAL from what it's at now to 50% less, but you'd at least have more relevant labeling. And the I wanted to show that, again, you have those peanuts and you could visualize it very quickly. So you don't have to go through how many times is it appearing, how many are in each food, but, are my chunks of peanuts bigger than the reference dose? Do I know that it could be remaining in there? Am I seeing it now and then? Having that type of information, we're not asking for sampling and analysis to know that it's 1 in 10,000 or 1 in a million, but I bet most operators could give you an estimate like that, roughly. They might not have sampling and analysis data, but you can have a good estimate about how often you see it. Is it there per day, per week, per shift, per hour? When, and if it is there, how big is it? So simple and effective things can be done. Some people will say, is this qualitative or quantitative? And I'd say, does that matter? You have the information you need at that point to then make the communications that are needed. If you wanted to do this slightly differently, you could take that same particulate, you could gather a few of them from your incoming ingredients. If you're sprinkling them on something, so you could measure how big the range is. Here I have 5 peanuts, 25% protein. So each particle is roughly 5 to 7.5 milligrams of total protein from peanut. Every one of the particles you're using is above the reference dose. I don't think you have to go farther and start measuring 50, because you know that they're going to be over in a number of cases. So conservatively, you're probably over the reference dose. So I want to highlight a few other things. You could do the same thing with cookie dough. You could see that after your initial cleaning and scraping, you have some chunks of dough that might be remaining. This might not be your final allergen clean before production, but at least you'd know if you miss something where you can't see it, what might be hiding in there. And then you could start to say, okay, the weight of that dough piece, it has a range of 70 to 110 milligrams. Non-fat dry milk is this much of the recipe. That means non-fat dry milk is roughly 4 to 6 milligrams of the dough pieces, roughly 36% protein. So the protein per particle is 1.4 to 2.2 milligrams. Reference dose is 2 milligrams of milk protein. So conservatively, we're seeing dough pieces that are over the reference dose. And if you know from your production, you're not always able to get every dough piece out of there, well, you're starting to see that it's probably over the reference dose in some cases. Conservatively, we'd likely be putting a may contain statement on there. So these are some of the types of things you can do with particulates that are relatively easy to do. A different version to go is a backwards calculation that says, all right, how much food or food soil is remaining on the equipment that it would take to exceed the reference dose? So you have a spice mixture that's 2% in your recipe formulation. You have 3.5% of that spice is non-fat dry milk. Again, the protein amount, you have the total protein percentage in the spice mix. You have a relatively decent sized mixture of 1,000 kilograms. Dry cleaning, brushing, scraping, you can see in it. So you can look in the mixer. And you're doing this for quality purposes, for flavor and color of your next product. So you have a potential for cross contact, can be visually expected. There's very little powder remaining when you're doing your quality cleans and checks. You have a packaged product, 75 grams per package. Use 2 packages for conservatism. It all comes through with that reference dose. And if you need all of this for the cross contact to make your calculations, it would take almost 53 kilograms of carryover from that milk containing recipe into the following product before you'd reach the reference dose. So for quality purposes, you have very little powder remaining in the equipment, and it would take almost 53 kilograms of powder in a 1,000 kilogram mixer before you reach an issue. So it's something where we might get so focused on a milligram amount that we lose the thread of, yeah, what we're doing for quality is also conservative for allergens in this case. So we want to be protective, of course. We want to keep doing our quality cleans, but we're also protective for allergens in this instance as well. And I wanted to put on there to highlight with 2 different cases, because we focus so much on the reference dose and the numbers and the cleaning and these things. And those are all very important. But every time we end up seeing a death or a fatal reaction, up until now, it's usually because of a mistake in consumers reading labels and they're eating something that contains it, or we had something that was mislabeled where they put the wrong product ingredient list on the product being consumed. So this one was a holiday product. As you might have experience with, holiday products in limited productions can be quite an issue for getting labeling correct or cleaning compared to your normal products. And soy nuts was listed as the second ingredient, but actually it had been changed from soy nuts to peanuts. The cookie looks similar to what's on the right there. So you can see those big chunks of peanuts compared to what I already showed you visually earlier. It doesn't take a really analytical analysis to say there'd be a lot of peanut eaten if you take even one bite, let alone one cookie. And with the amounts that it would take to cause a reaction, unfortunately, that was enough to cause a fatal reaction in someone. This is not limited just to food production. This is also in a restaurant type situation. The major issues are when someone's eating something containing an allergen and not knowing that it's there. So all of this text would be there for you to read, but essentially the front of house manager went around the restaurant's rules for allergens and didn't consult with the chefs, but took care of it themselves and ended up serving a sesame containing hummus to a sesame allergic person, and they had a fatal reaction. So information sharing, labeling, those are the bigger issues to make sure that we have right compared to what we're probably already doing in a very good way for quality cleaning, sanitation in the food production sites. As Joe said, this is my last slide that I want to say. We've seen an immediate impact in the Netherlands, in Australia where they updated Vital, in Belgium, also in Germany. They're using this in Germany. They're using the reference doses from the FAO WHO to make sure that their analytical control laboratories for foods are able to have appropriate methods. They're also using about a 10-fold lower factor at the ED1 for free from. So they're also doing risk-based free from assessments and not just is it there or not there. So that's something to keep in mind. I know we're pretty close to time. Apologies for that, but I'm definitely available for more questions as long as you need.
Thank you both for your talks. It was very interesting. We are close to